All right, hello, welcome back. My name is Jim. This is Raise Game Fully. This is a video platform where I talk about older aspects of the Dungeons & Dragons game. In this series, I've been talking about a game world called Mystara, and I've been examining various products related to fleshing out the nations of Mystara, and this is a continuation of that series. These are obviously compatible with older edition of the game. I'm sure a lot of you play 5th edition. This may not necessarily fit in with your campaign world, but nonetheless, I'm talking about the product to, one, show you how cool it was, and two, to give you some ideas in case you want to use part or all of this material in your own campaign world. In this video today, I'll be talking about Gazetteer number 7, The Northern Reaches, written by Ken Ralston. Now, the Northern Reaches is a different approach from the other gazetteers I've talked about in this series, in that it speaks about multiple nations on the D&D game world of Mystara. If you can think back to the map I showed you from the Expert Rulebook, the Northern Reaches are set apart on the very, very northern fringe of the continent. And here's a piece of that map here. In previous videos, I've talked about some of the lands that you can see here, the Grand Duchy of Karamikos, the Emirates of Alaroam, and today I'm talking about the Northern Reaches, which comprise 3 different nations on the very coastal part here. The product covers all 3 nations as a whole due to many factors, but primarily because of the culture that the 3 nations share. The area of the Northern Reaches is bordered here in red. It comprises 3 different nations, the first being the Kingdom of Vestland, the second is the Soderfjord Jarldoms, and the third is the Kingdom of Ostland. All these share a common history, a common culture, and can collectively be described in one product, which they've done. Now, at the beginning of all of my videos, I tried to describe the flavor of a setting, just to give everybody an idea of what's happening and kind of put a picture to the words. Very simply put, the Northern Reaches describes the Viking culture of real life. I think everybody knows what I mean when I talk about Vikings. They are Scandinavian peoples from Norway, Sweden, Denmark, who were famous for being fierce warriors and sailors. The author of the product actually addresses this fact on page 1 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. I'll highlight it here. The subcaption actually says, "Is this Vikings or what?" And the answer was yes or no. Much of the culture described in the Northern Reaches is Viking-esque. It has a similar style to it, architecture, social structure, culture, but of course it's not real-world Vikings. This is Dungeons & Dragons. There's magic, there's clerical magic, there's wizardly magic, there are non-humans who live here. So even though it's heavily based on Vikings, and that will give you a very, very firm idea of what we're talking about today, it's definitely not based on the real-life Viking peoples. The following page on the Dungeon Master's Guide actually has a really, really neat section on suggested readings if you wanted to learn more about the culture or the feel of the adventure. It gives you some suggested readings, complete with Dewey Decimal System numbers, if you know what that means. Much more recently, there's been some media that have been published in regards to Vikings. The 2 that come to mind are the Netflix show Vikings, and there's a great anime out there called Vinland Saga, 2 of my personal favorites, which really will give you a sense of what this culture, warrior, sailor culture is all about. Okay, so back to the cover of the product. As I mentioned, it was written by Ken Ralston. The artwork is done by Clyde Caldwell, who did all of the artwork for all the Gazetteers. I feel like it summarized the flavor of the campaign very, very well. The inside cover of the product contained maps. This here is a map of something called Falun Cavern, which I will get to later on in the adventures section. There are some other maps here. This is the bottom left is a map of the royal court of the King of Ostland. The right side of the panel depicts a fort in Sodafjord. It's called Ragnar's Fort. Ragnar is the war leader of Sodafjord. And the top left part of the panel shows a small section of a map describing homesteads, which also factor into the adventure section of the book. There was a large fold-out map that came with the product. On one side of the map was this marvelous diagram of a Jarl's Hall, a fortified hall, and it was designed to in scale with some cardboard cutouts that came with the product. I unfortunately did not have the Northern Reaches in print. I've had to rely on digital copies. But if you're fortunate enough to own a print copy, hopefully you have the little cardboard cutouts that came with the product. And there were several halls that you could build. There were fences, and I think there were livestock. There were warrior tokens. So if you were to play out one of the adventures in the module, or if you were just designing your own adventure, you could actually use this as your map for your miniatures, be they cardboard or war tokens, or if you had actual figurines too, it would work really, really well. I thought that was a great feature to the Gazetteer. The other side of the large paper fold-out map that came with the product is shown here. I'll cut away and show this on a larger screen. On the right side is a color hex map of the three nations of the Northern Reaches. Again, Ostland is the island and the islands in the sea. Vestland is the northernmost land in the Northern Reaches, and Sodafjord is the southernmost nation in the Northern Reaches. Sodafjord has a lot more geographical features. It's a large swamp you can probably see there on the map, more mountainous and hilly terrain. The upper left part of the map is a drawing of the city of Norvik, which is the capital of Vestland, and it's done in the same style as the other city maps in the Gazetteer series, where different colors on the map represent different sections of the city in terms of social status, and you can see the harbor there. Below the map of Norvik, there are a couple of diagrams of different types of longships that the Northmen use in their raiding and in their warfare. In the center of the map, you will see not only a legend, but you'll see the caltrops that they defend their harbor with. The bottom left of the map is a map drawing of Zeeburg, the capital of Ostland. And in the bottom center of the large map is Sodafjord, which is the capital, so to speak, of the Sodafjord Jarldoms, including Ragnar's Fort in the center there, which was detailed on the inside cover that I just showed you. Okay, let's dive right into the player's book. Out of all the Gazetteers I've talked about so far in my video series, the player's book in the Northern Reaches has the most material. There is a lot of material in here. I'm going to try to cover it as best I can without making my video too long. It starts in a similar fashion to the other Gazetteers in the series. It starts with what everyone knows. And these are little interviews that you might meet people in a tavern or on a street or a merchant, and they just kind of give you some guidelines to the culture itself. In this particular Gazetteer, because there are three different cultures, there are different sections here that describe the nations to a visitor. The first one that's on the screen here is about the Kingdom of Ostland. The second one is about the Kingdom of Vestland, and the third one is about the Kingdom of Sodafjord. To oversimplify it, the three kingdoms in the Northern Reaches can very oversimply be described as a very lawful kingdom, a very chaotic kingdom, and a neutral kingdom. Ostland, which was the nation of islands in the ocean, is very, very lawful. There's a high king. Religion is mandated by the king. Things are very, very structured, very, very tightly controlled government, and he's got a very strong grip on power. The kingdom of Sodafjord is very, very loosely organized. It's much more chaotic. The Jarls, or local chieftains, very rarely agree on things. They're more concerned with grabbing land and fame and power, often at the expense of their neighbors. There's no crime with that in their eyes. It's very, very disorganized and every man for himself mentality. They have come together in recent years to elect a war chieftain. This is something that they realize that being divided, they're easy prey for other nations. And they've elected a war leader by the name of Ragnar. He controls the military in times of need, but he's personally trying to consolidate power and transform Sodafjord into a more united country. I'll get into that later. And Vestland is somewhere in the middle. Vestland has a high king. They have a very, very well-educated nobility. They have a fairly structured tier system and caste system. I think Vestland is probably described as the most efficient, organized, civilized nation of the three nations. So the what everyone knows section kind of just summarizes that in general. The people there are farmers, they're warriors, and in Ostland it's very tightly controlled by the king and his court. In Sodafjord, your loyalty is to your Jarl. There's not a whole lot of central government involved, and in Vestland it's somewhere in the middle. This continues on with what everyone knows. I just love the artwork here. Looks like some people just kind of drinking in a tavern. And then on this page here about what everyone knows, there's a section on an outsider's perspective. And I did want to read this to you. This is from the author himself in the guise of an NPC wizard. And the subject that was asked of him is contrasting the three nations. How can you compare and contrast the three nations? And the text here says, Ostland clings to tradition, while Vestland struggles to be a more modern nation. Sodafjord lies somewhere in between. Many folk in the Jarldoms still hold firmly to the Northman values, but small, influential groups, particularly the merchant class in the growing towns, want to see Sodafjord a modern trading nation like Vestland. Their money buys influence and political power, so the traditionalists cannot ignore them. Ostland is a barbarian culture, with an emphasis on the warrior virtues, where a leader must defend his authority through personal strength of arms. Vestland is a more modern nation, where the authority of the law, rather than the personal strength of arms, protects its citizens. Sodafjord is a young nation in transition from the older barbarian ways like Ostland's to a more modern culture like Vestland's. In Sodafjord, the larger the town, the more modern the local values. Conversely, the more remote the place, the more traditional and barbaric the people will be. Yet, even in Sodafjord's current turbulent political climate, it's possible to see in the growing power of the war leader Ragnar. Every year he looks more capable of uniting the Jarldoms into a nation like Vestland. Unfortunately, there are many other nations, particularly Ostland, Alaroam, Ethengar, and Thyatis, those are two nations I haven't spoken about yet, that prefer the current political chaos in the Jarldom. So it's a very, very varied nation, if you will. The northern reaches are only united by this common culture, this common history, and the political situation varies greatly from place to place within the three nations. There is a large section on society. There's a good 5 pages here about what society is like. How there's the warrior elite, there are the farmers, the nation of Ostland has slaves. Vestland and Sodafjord do not. They do have servants or thralls, which are poor, but they're technically freemen. So it describes rank, the social order, how the priests fit into all this. The Northmen have great belief in the gods. The priests of the Northlands have a long history of being involved in the culture, in the politics, in daily life. There's actually different types of priests I'll get to in a few minutes. One of them stays in the home. So religion is very, very personal to the Northmen. and this section talks about that at length. There's a section on law. There really aren't any judges like other nations that you might be familiar with. Very often there's a wise man or a jarl or a chieftain who will hear a complaint or will hear both sides of an argument, and it's generally agreed that any Northman knows what's right and wrong. So just by having life experience and knowing the warrior's code, or by knowing the code of the gods, the person in power will hear the argument or hear the grievance and just decide on the law. Whether or not that law gets enforced varies among the three nations in the northern reaches. In Ostland, the laws are quickly enforced upon pain of death. In Vestland, they are, for the most part, carried out faithfully, and in Sodafjord, sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. There's a small section in the Northland Society section about dwarves. There's a fairly large population of dwarves in the northern reaches, and I'll get to that in a little bit later on when I talk about non-humans. The next section in the player's guide deals with creating player characters from the northern reaches. This is very, very unique among the gazetteers that I've discussed so far. For the most part, it's the same character creation process that happens in basic Dungeons & Dragons. You roll up your character, you pick a class, you buy equipment. But there are optional things that are available to Northmen that aren't available to other characters. They do have a skill system similar to other gazetteers, which I've talked about before, and these are based on your ability scores. So for example, you could take an intelligence skill such as craftsmanship, you could take a charisma skill such as singing, you could take a strength skill such as brawling. These are the same skills that have been used in other products, and they should be fairly familiar to anybody who has looked at them. What the Northern Reaches did differently was they created a system for personality traits. And this is pretty cool. I just want to go into it a little bit. There are a group of personality traits, and you would have either a lot or a little of all of these traits that would kind of help redefine your character. And I feel this was very forward-thinking at the time. I feel like this kind of helped mold future editions of Dungeons & Dragons. For example, nowadays everybody has perception. It's very, very common to have someone roll perception to see if they discover something. So that didn't exist in basic D&D unless you chose to have a skill that would allow you to do that. With these personality skills here, it gave you an extra dimension to your character rather. The personality traits that exist here are how cautious or rash you are, how modest or proud, peaceful or violent, generous or greedy, courageous, forgiving, trusting, loyal. And you would choose for your character how much of these traits they possessed. There's a chart here, if you can read it, on the left side of this page. It describes the traits. It gives national modifiers to these traits, which is pretty neat. If you are from a nation listed here, just as an example, Alaruam, you would get a +2 to your revenance score, but a -1 penalty to forgiveness, modesty, and you would also get a +1 to your dogmatic score. The personality traits obviously were an optional system, and they're essentially the same as skills, but it was really cool way to add an extra dimension to your role-playing. Is your character forgiving? Are they not forgiving? Could they make a roll to see if something triggered them in one of those areas? If they were honest versus deceitful and someone asked them to lie, how good would they be at doing that? So I guess in one respect it's good because it helps you define your character, and it works really great for NPCs. But I guess on the other side, it's kind of not letting the player role-play themselves. But anyway, it was a really cool system that they developed to add some extra dimension to your character. The next section in the player's guide deals with higher level characters obtaining a dominion. This is something that they talk about in the companion rules. This may not be something that's familiar to many of you. Upon reaching a high enough level, say 14th or 15th, there were a new set of rules that were available to you that described things like mass combat, running a dominion, being a lord, planar travel, things along those lines. This section here in the player's book talks about obtaining a dominion in accordance with those rules. And the angle the author takes is to obtain one, you basically have to challenge an existing clan holder or jarl, or disprove their worth in some way. You have to take over an existing property, unless you want to forge out into the wilderness and found your own. So what they've listed here, this is a list of all the clans and dominions in the Kingdom of Ostland. The following pages list all of the clans and dominions in both Vestland and Soderfjord, as you can see here. Then the book goes back to skills. In the standard use of skills, starting characters would get 4 skills, and possibly more depending on their intelligence score. With the Northern Reaches, you might want to be, if you can blow this up, the Northern Reaches would kind of dictate some of the skills you had to take based on your class. So just for example, if you can see section A, if the character is a fighter, an elf, or a dwarf, the class-related skills they have to take are Fighting Instinct and Intimidate. And then the other 2 would kind of be like free choices to choose whatever you wish. Just to continue down here, the thief or a halfling would have to take Surprise and Evade. The cleric would have to take Read Runes and Honor Immortal. And the magic user would have to take Read or Write Languages and Ancient History. And then after that, they could choose skills that they wanted. Family status is a big thing to the Northmen. You have to know who your clan is, who your family is. Reputation is a big thing. They'll often, when they introduce themselves, they'll introduce themselves as son of so-and-so, or they'll brag about some deed they did. And the respect and honor associated with your family is a big deal. So when creating a character from the Northland, it's important to know just where your family's status is in relation to other families in the area. So there's a little chart here describing that. There's also a chart about heyday gifts. In the Northern Reaches culture, 16 is the age of adulthood. And very typically when you turn 16, you would get a gift or present from your family to kind of wish you well on your journey into adulthood. So there's a section here that talks about heyday gifts. There's also a page here that describes afflictions and accidents. It talks about different diseases or plagues. It's super interesting, and I thought it was great. It felt a little out of place for me. But in a culture that's so focused on being the best that you can in terms of fighting ability or status, I mean, I guess it makes sense that if you do have an affliction or accident, you would be knocked down a few notches in the social ladder. So to have some afflictions and accidents here is kind of cool, even though it did feel a little out of place. The next page also talks about past events. This goes a lot into background, your character development. Some people are really into developing a backstory for their characters. Some players aren't really into that as much. But if you choose, there are tables here to talk about your past experiences. The page breaks down, which can be done by die roll with the numbers here if you wish. Past experiences that help shape your character, building events that made you who you are. This is great for NPCs too. And there's a combat experience table if you wanted to like weave these into your character's backstory. The next page talks about names. It lists quite a few name suggestions to kind of give you a sense of what the names of the Northmen sound like. Both male, female are listed there. There's also a section on nicknames, which is neat, which kind of gives you one of those suffixes to add to your character, because reputation is so important to the Northmen. The next section is about clerics. This is really cool. It's kind of long. I won't go into all the details. The clerics in the Northern Reaches are called, a single cleric is called a Godi. Plural of that is Godar. So there are 3 main types of Godar in the Northern Reaches. There's a household Godar. This is kind of like a community leader who lives in a village, takes care of the people that are there, They maintain shrines, kind of like a small town type of cleric. The next one is a monastic or a temple godar, and these are priests for various reasons that dwell in holy places, and they kind of live there or maintain the area. People sometimes settle around there, sometimes they don't, and they are devoted to the temple itself. And the third type of godar are wandering godar. Sometimes they just travel from place to place to interact with people and teach people about the gods. The Northmen believe that the gods are present in the natural world around them. So some priests and clerics feel that they can be more closely associated with the gods by traveling. So that's just a neat way to add to your character's backstory or to add to their personality. Are they the type of person who likes to wander? Are they the type of person who likes to settle down? I imagine most PCs would be the wandering type, but it does describe these three facets of clerics in the Northlands here. It talks about shrines, religious observances. There's tons of information here. The author did an amazing job. I'm not going to get into it too much, just for time purposes. The gods that the immortals, rather, that the Northmen worship are have names very similar to the gods of the Vikings. So you've got Thor and Odin and Freya. One nice thing that the book describes is if you are a cleric of these particular gods or goddesses, you get to swap out spells to kind of individualize your spell casting ability. Odin's priests, instead of purify food and water, they get read languages. Instead of snake charm, and these are spells, if you look at the spell list from the expert or basic rulebook, you'll see these spells. Instead of snake charm, the priests of Odin get a magic spear, which is essentially a magic missile spell, which my cleric could cast magic missile. That's fantastic. They have these abilities to detect lies when they reach 7th level, and they earn the nickname of Ravens. They're called the Ravens of Odin. Really cool customization things here. The clerics of Thor have all kinds of combat abilities. They get some unique spells as well. 2nd level clerical spell, Berserk, which allows you to get a +2 bonus to hit, and you get a second attack every round. There's a spell called Fist of Thor, which gives your weapon, essentially turns your weapon into a magic weapon. So it gives it +3 damage for their warhammers that the clerics like to use. Clerics associated with Frey or Freya get a protective bonus to their armor class. There are some evil immortals that exist in the Northern Reaches. They're not popularized. They don't have temples in cities. They're kind of cult-like, out-of-the-way religions. One worships Loki. Their big thing is they get to learn the reversed form of spells, which are very often evil in nature. There is a cult to Hel, an evil goddess. Hel is downright outlawed in a lot of places, but they make a great evil NPC for your adventures if you have to go and save somebody from the priestesses or the clerics of Hel. These clerics and priestesses have particular access to necromancy spells, raise dead, etc., etc., which is basically shunned and abhorred by the Northmen. There's a large section in the player's book on rune magic. This is really amazing. This is really clever. To put it shortly and to try to summarize it, there are a set of runes, magic letters, that clerics have access to. You can't decipher them with read magic or with read languages. You have to have special rune magic that only Northmen cleric have. The lore behind it is it's a throwback to an older time, and the clerics are recipients of this passed down knowledge, and it's kind of strange and unique to the area, and it's a closely guarded secret that the clerics have to use this rune magic. Essentially, the way it works is they go through a ritual to discover a rune. And then when they know the rune, they can cast it on something, such as a standing stone, as a marker, or cast it upon a weapon. And then they can cast another clerical spell to activate that rune and draw out its magic and use it. The wild thing about this is the runes are imbued with a sense, a personal piece of the cleric who casts it. So if I'm a cleric and I inscribe a rune and I leave it there, and then a month from now a wandering cleric comes by and activates that rune, I am aware that my rune was activated. So there's kind of like a sense among all of the priests in the Northlands of kind of knowing what's happening or being in tune with the magical energy of the place. The rune magic rules in play get a little complicated in terms of how to cast them and how to draw their magic out. There are spells you need to know. You have to bless a rune to activate its power. You have to have a different spell to inscribe a rune. So it's a little bit complicated in that respect. I'm not going to get into that. This section talks about the 24 runes of Odin and their effects. Just to pick one at random, on the right side of the paper here is one called Kauna. Kauna Fire. The rune signifies warm-giving hearth, the light-giving torch, and the destructive power of wildfire. The rune burns like a torch for 2 hours, yet does not consume the material the rune is inscribed upon. The fire can burn in heavy rain, but not while submerged. The rune burns intensely for the duration of the spell. If a 2-hit roll is made, the victim takes 3d4 damage when struck. So it's a light source, it's a fire source, you can imbue it, you can put it on things and draw out its fire for future use. And these runes run the gamut. There's all kinds of protective runes, there's damaging runes. The one above it, just for example, Redu, for a 6-hour period. The cleric activating it gets a +2 to constitution checks. So these runes are just a great addition to the game in general, but I think they gave such a great flavor to Northman clerics. And I think at surface value, when we talk about the Northmen or the Northern Reaches, everyone's first instinct is to play a fighter, like a berserker, a barbarian, wielding an axe and just like chopping people to pieces. But there's a big attraction, at least to me, to clerics with these rune powers. I just thought it was a great addition to the game. Okay, that is the end of the player's guide. I'm going to now dive into the Dungeon Master's book. The first page or two I already talked about with the note from the author about the Viking culture. The first section after that is the history of the Northern Reaches. And it's quite extensive. I'm not going to go into it. There's the timeline here if you want to blow it up and look at it. Basically, years ago, there were hordes of monsters that settled in the area. Giants and trolls, gnomes and dwarves, kobolds. And the humans that live in the Northern Reaches now kind of wandered there from other places. If you think back to that map of the section of the map from the expert rulebook, just off the northern border of the Northern Reaches, off of that map, there's a very, very large expanse of land that has a similar culture to the Northern Reaches, which I will deal with in another video. So there are lots of migrant peoples coming down from the far north. The Northern Reaches is kind of the southern extent of that geography, of that culture, of that Northland culture. So people came here centuries ago and they warred among themselves and with the monsters and demi-humans they found there. Eventually, about 500 years ago, a very powerful leader united Ostland and exerted his dominance over all of the Northern Reaches. He was a high king. He and his descendants kind of ruled the Northern Reaches very, very tightly for many, many years until Vestland broke away from Ostland, created its own kingdom, and then Sodafjord kind of was too messy and too chaotic to control. So they settled into the three nations that exist today of Ostland, Vestland, and Sodafjord. And they really haven't changed a whole lot, with the possible exception of Vestland, who are trying to modernize. That's the history of the region in a synopsis. There's a section here on geography. Very, very quickly, the geography is mountainous, not great farmland. There's small patches here and there where people make homesteads, but it's primarily mountainous, hilly. There's a large swamp in Sodafjord that I mentioned on the map, and the people exist by sailing up and down the rivers, through the valleys. They raid other areas, but it's very, very mountainous, cold, and hilly. If you think back to that expert map, it is kind of strange that the northern reaches are just one mountain range away from a desert, from Alarawam. There's a lot that goes into that, both climate-wise and magic-wise. I'll probably deal with that in another video, but for the most part, it's just a cold, mountainous land of rivers and occasional grassland. The Dungeon Master's Guide goes on to discuss the three nations in the northern reaches, starting with Ostland, which I've kind of talked about this already. Ostland has the strong central government. It's very, very dictatorial in a way. The government tightly controls everything. The reason that the kings of Ostland have had so much success is outlined here in this section. One of the things that they do in Ostland, the king has a court of all of the finest nobles and the warriors, and all the most talented and promising people come to the king's court and are technically part of the king's court. When it's time for the king to abdicate or give up his power, the king doesn't always choose a blood relative to inherit the throne. Very often it is, but sometimes it's not. And this pool of talented people, be they warriors or otherwise, give a lot of competition. They give the king lots of choices as to who to succeed him. He could pick the strongest warrior. If that person isn't related to him, it's not a big deal, because they're all considered children of the court. If it is a child of the king, or if the child of the king isn't the strongest candidate, being involved in this community of great warriors makes them better. It kind of is a very competitive ground for the future rulers of Ostland to kind of compete and stake their claim. So Ostland has always had a large group of people to choose from to keep the kingdom going, based on either their military prowess or their personal beliefs. The king of Ostland has a very large personal guard called the Raven Guard. He's got about 900 men who are his personal guards. He can probably summon thousands of warriors at any given moment. So it's a very, very militaristic king. What's happening currently in Ostland is the current king, who's named Horde Darkeye. He and his wife were pregnant with their first child, and she died in childbirth and lost the child. Since then, King Horde has kind of fallen into a depressed state. He's not terribly concerned with outside events. There is a loose alliance with the Empire of Thyatis to the south that he's only kind of half interested in. And this has allowed other people to kind of creep into the picture and start to exert influence in and around the court. Most notably, his new wife, the young queen Yrsa. Yrsa is very motivated, she's very ambitious, and she's trying to consolidate loyal people to her instead of the king. In addition, the priests of Odin have kind of filled in the blanks, jumped into the power struggle, and they're trying to exert their influence around Zeeburg and the other parts of Ostland to try to influence events in their own way. There are also other jarls and lords who are trying to grab a little bit of the power in the king's lack of involvement. There is tons of politicking going on in Ostland, and that's a great place for adventures. I'm not going to get into all the subtle things that are happening because it'll take too long. The next section of the DM's book talks about the Kingdom of Vestland. And as I mentioned, it's a fairly modern monarchy. It's got a strong aristocracy, very loyal to the king. They're much more modern thinking than the Ostlanders. As I mentioned, they don't keep slaves. It's ruled by King Harald Gudmundsson. And unlike in Ostland, the King of Vestland has a royal council to help him rule. It's not just a sole autocrat with any advisors that he chooses. There's a council to help him rule, which kind of gives it more of a democratic flavor. The king is more open to ideas, especially from other nations. Councilmen have traveled to other nations. They tell the king about other nations, and I think that's why Vestland is more modern and more forward-thinking than Ostland, for example. There is a personal guard here as well. It's called the Home Guard. It's not quite as powerful or as large as the one in Ostland, but they are very skilled. There are some current events happening in Vestland that the party can wander into for adventure ideas. There's a town called Runa in the southern part of Vestland. It's kind of a busy, dirty frontier town, but it's on a trade route, so it does see its fair share of traffic and money and merchants pass through. The leader of Runa styles himself a duke in the fashion of the Karamekians or the Thyacians, so the ruler of Runa is called Duke. There is a published adventure that took place in Runa. It was Dungeon Module X3, The Curse of Xanaton. If anybody wanted to check that out, this is where it is located. There is some clan warfare that's taking place in the hills away from the cities of Vestland, so any type of squabble between Jarls or any type of military actions would make good adventures here in Vestland as well. People are hiring guards, they could hire soldiers as mercenaries in a struggle, so there's adventure opportunity here as well. There's a section of Vestland called Trollheim. Years ago, the humans and the trolls were tired of fighting each other, so the king granted land officially to the trolls. And since then, nobody's been happy with it. So there are always troubles with the troll lands in and around Trollheim. So that could be the basis for an adventure or two, or even a mini setting if you wanted to set up a small village down there and have excursions into and out of the troll lands. The trolls are often like raiding as well, so there might be a reward for stolen items that somebody wants returned to them. The next section deals with Sodafjord. It's kind of funny because the first subsection here is called Government, and the Jarls of Sodafjord work very hard at not having a government. They are always bickering with each other. They're always trying to outdo and best each other. As I mentioned, they have elected a war leader because they realize that they want to present a strong front against foreign nations. So there's a lot of talk around what they've called the Defense League. How important is the Defense League? Who supports the Defense League? Who doesn't support the Defense League? The situation in Sodafjord is just complete chaos and squabbling between local lords who are always trying to outdo each other. There are some current things happening in Sodafjord besides the battling that are pretty interesting. There's a rumor of a witch queen that lives in the swamp. She goes through the swamp at night with undead servants looking for her dead husband. That's a great adventure hook to use. There are lots of things going on in the southern hills having to do with monsters. There are lots of gnolls and kobolds living in Sodafjord, which can lead itself to all types of adventures or all types of adventuring opportunities, be they combat or diplomatic, which leads into the next section of the gazetteer titled Non-Human Races. It starts with dwarves. There are a lot of dwarves in the northern reaches. A couple of reasons. One is it literally borders the dwarven kingdom. If you noticed on the map I showed you at the beginning of the video, there's a dwarven kingdom just to the southwest of the northern reaches, so dwarves just happen to migrate here for whatever reason. They can find employment, or maybe they're tired of the political situation back home. And these are the same as dwarves in other parts of the world, or basically across D&D in general. The dwarves are fairly similar, and you kind of are the same as you would expect. The exception, and this is really interesting, the exception is this group of dwarves called the Modriswerg. The Modriswerg are a group of dwarves that were exiled from the Dwarven Kingdom years ago for researching dark magic. And they're kind of the equivalent of dark elves. So the Modriswerg are basically dark dwarves that live under the mountains, under the hills, and they spend a lot of time crafting things, whether they're weapons or magical enchantments. It's a very large section here on them. I find them fascinating. I think this is a really cool addition to the setting and to D&D in general. It doesn't give a whole lot of provision for playing a Modriswerg dwarf. It's very easily adaptable if you wanted to do that, but they're more designed to be NPCs or to be people to interact with in the nature of the sagas in the Viking sagas in real life. The dwarves would always be involved in making wondrous items or being mischievous and then disappearing back into their mountain. So I feel like this subclass of dwarves was created for that purpose. There's a great drawing here of a dark dwarf working at his table. The name in the game lore is described as meaning the word rotten or evil. So the nickname for the Modriswerg is the Rot Dwarves. So here you can see a Rot Dwarf working at his bench, crafting items. It does go on to, there's several pages on the Modriswerg, like their culture and their trades and their crafts. Too much for me to get into in my short video. It does give some examples of their crafts. Intelligent swords, cold-based spells. Great side hook in case you wanted to lead the party into a different area. Perhaps they know the Modriswerg exist and they seek them out, or perhaps they're chasing another adventure hook and they stumble across them. It's just a great addition to the Gazetteer and to any campaign in general. There's a section here on the trolls. I mentioned the trolls were promised their own section of the Northern Reaches, and then nobody really cared to enforce that rule, so there's a lot of skirmishing back and forth. Talks about some noted troll personalities. This is a great character here called Two Ox Charlie. He's domesticated, if you will. He's owned by the King of Ostland, King Horde, and he's always there in the King's Hall. He'll be serving dinner, or he'll be interacting with people. He loves the Queen. He loves Queen Yrsa, who just kind of puts up with him as kind of annoying. But he speaks common, and he's just a great character. I wanted to bring him up. There's a section here on hill gnolls. Gnolls are these dog men. I may have mentioned them in speaking about Karamikos. But there's a gnoll culture here. Nothing too interesting. Just talks about who they worship and their crafts and their technology. There's a small note here about the gnoll chieftain Kaberu, and he's becoming a war leader and gathering a lot of followers to his cause. So maybe gnoll raids can figure into your story if you wish. The next section of the DM's book talks about the court of Canute. Canute is the legendary king who united Ostland centuries ago, and it's still called the court of Canute, even though the current king is named Horde. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of politics going on at the court of Canute, and this talks about the personalities involved. King Horde Dark Eye, who's a very powerful fighter. He's just really, really disenfranchised with a lot of things. His high priest is Asgrim. Goes on to talk about Queen Ursa, who a lot of people are flocking to. She has a lot of people's loyalty and attention. This is great background material. I've never been able to develop, I've never run a campaign in the Northern Reaches, but to me, this background information, as amazing as it is, I was never able to pull it all successfully into a campaign, but there's tons of it here should you choose to use it. This is a small picture here of Ursa, Asgrim, and Horde, left to right. The next section of the DM's book talks about adventures. And unlike other gazetteers that had 5 or 6 or 10 small adventure hooks, this has 3 or 4 pretty well thought out, developed adventures. The first being Falun Caverns. If you remember back to the beginning of the video, there's a map on the inside cover of the product that dealt with the Falun Caverns. It was a very, very large complex that was diagrammed there. To put it simply, Falun Caverns were an underground cave complex that were inhabited by gnomes many, many, many centuries ago, and they've all perished or left for whatever reason. The caves have subsequently been inhabited by a race of kobolds, and this makes a great series of adventures, makes a great setting for a series of adventures to go in, explore, possibly battle the kobolds. It's possible to deal with them diplomatically if you wish. There are really old-fashioned gnome machines there, be they magical or non-magical. There's lots of things to do to go into Falun and try to recover or to deal with the kobolds. One thing I'll touch upon is the leader. There's 2 main leaders to the kobold faction. There's the warrior leader of the kobolds, who's depicted on the right. His name is Usag, I think, and his clerical advisor, Throg. So I think it's Throg and Usag. The warrior leader of the chieftain of the kobolds, Usag, found a set of plate armor from an adventurer recently. And of course, the kobolds worship a deity called the Shining One. He's supposed to be brilliant and terrible and terrifying. So the kobold leader took the armor from this dead adventurer and wears it as a status symbol of his right to run the kobold clans. And Throg is a shaman. He's got rudimentary clerical powers. The 2 of them sometimes work together, sometimes work at odds to lead raids out into the human lands and acquire more wealth and booty. There's a large number of kobolds in the cave. I think I saw it was somewhere in the area of 300 to 400 kobolds. So plenty of adventure here if you, as a DM, decide to do that. And it's open to change. You can, add places, remove places, augment the kobold's strength or detract from it if it's too powerful for your party. There's a lot to do in the caverns. Another adventure that's talked about here involves Octel's homestead. There was a small diagram map of it on the inside cover, and it deals with a man named Otkel Arnulfsson and just all kinds of problems that he's having at his homestead, being invaded by other homesteaders, other warriors. He may have irritated a jarl. The whole thing, the whole adventure revolves around the defense of his homestead, which you could use that large diagram on the back of the paper map if you wanted to, just to have a battle take place in and around the homestead. But that's a very, very common theme in the Northern Reaches, as you may have gathered. The pages here just get into all the particulars, who the NPCs are of the homestead, what's their statistics and their weapons and their equipment, and kind of just sets up some background stories to explain the conflict that would happen there. Here are some of the characters involved. Love the artwork, just not want to get into all the details of all the characters. The next section talks about setting up a campaign in the Northern Reaches. It's very interesting. Most commonly in Dungeons & Dragons, we talk about meeting people in the tavern, going to the tavern, interacting with people, maybe sharing some ale and discussing and stories and rumors from other lands. Apart from the large cities in the Northern Reaches, there aren't really taverns. You won't just happen across an inn. You won't just happen across a tavern. The people of the Northern Reaches are given more to personal hospitality. They'll invite you into their home. You can stay with somebody, which gets back to the tribal nature or the family nature. You stay with a cousin. You stay with an aunt. You stay with somebody who helped out your mother years ago. So there aren't taverns per se. But people are very welcoming and they're very accommodating. You could just, like a bed and breakfast, help yourself into somebody's house, maybe meet them, talk to them. That's a way that you can set up adventures. This section here breaks down adventures by class and level. Only a fraction of the numbers presented here represent adventurers. Like it talks about what percentage of the population you come across are going to be non-adventure dwarves versus veteran dwarves. What percentage of the people that you come across are going to be armed and skilled with those arms. It gives you clan choices, alternate clan choices, to have a central base for your adventures if you want to design them. It also talks about rune magic. It talks about witches. This was really, really cool. There's a subclass of magic users, women magic users called witches, and they have access to only a small number of spells. It's kind of something that's not as developed as scholarly magic in a place like Alphatia or Glantry, if you know about those places. It's just something more rudimentary, more basic, more barbaric, and it does list some spells here that the witches have access to. It talks about preventing abuses of the skill system. If you have a campaign set in the Northern Reaches and you choose to use those optional skill systems I talked about, it gives you some tips on to how to prevent the players from abusing them. The last page of this particular section deals with drawing in real-world influences to help give your Northern Reaches campaign setting more reality or a more real flavor. I really don't think that's necessary. In my opinion, the Northern Reaches Gazetteer is probably more realistic, based on more realistic human culture than any of the other Gazetteer products. I felt like it was very thorough, very in-depth. But it does talk about a concept called the 9 Worlds of Immortal Realms. I think this has to do with Yggdrasil and Asgard and the world, how all the universes are connected. I think the Marvel superhero movies delved into this a little bit, but it's a good way of tying things together to help create a lasting campaign setting for your Northern Reaches campaign. If you want to run one there, you can branch off to other worlds via magical gates or doors if you so choose. All right, well, that was it. I tried to get to most of the stuff in this Gazetteer. There's a lot of great stuff that you may not necessarily associate with a Viking culture, the D&D-ified version of it in Mystara. Super interesting, super amazing, and as I touched upon, it will come back in the future when I talk about the places off of the expert level map. And this culture, this Northman culture, is very, very prominent in some other products that I will be discussing in a future video. That's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Jim. This is Raise Game Fully, and please remember to be kind to your fellow players.